The call came as I was kneeling, picking up ceramic shards from a linoleum floor. Mrs. Henderson next door. She was already shouting about my sprinklers, her voice a thin, angry blade through the apartment wall, cutting into the mundane quiet of a Tuesday afternoon. 65 years, and it still felt like I was forever cleaning up messes that weren't entirely my fault. The kind that accumulates slowly, like dust on old memories. The coffee had spread, dark and bitter, matching the taste in my mouth even before the phone rang the 5th time. I stood, tossing the soaked towel into the sink, a gesture of resignation to whatever interruption now awaited. "Jerry Flores speaking," I said, my voice already bracing for impact. It was Janet Morrison, her tone carefully professional, the kind of voice that precedes an inevitable, heavy truth. She spoke of Brianna Elizabeth Flores, a name I hadn't heard fully pronounced in 15 years. My hand tightened on the receiver, a warning bell sounding deep in my gut, a tremor I knew all too well. Brianna had passed away on Tuesday evening, 3 days ago, while I worried about waterlogged begonias and coffee stains. The words were a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left me breathless and sinking into the kitchen chair. Its familiar creak suddenly too loud, a discordant note in the echoing silence. They found my number listed as an emergency contact, a relic from a life that felt impossibly distant, a ghost of a past identity. Previously married, she'd said, reducing 22 years to a mere legal footnote, a line on a form. Yes, I divorced in 2010. The words came automatically, muscle memory from years of filling out identical paperwork. A beneficiary, she'd added, inviting me to the will reading. The word felt foreign, impossible, like a forgotten language. Brianna had built her empire after we separated, transforming a small consulting business into something vast, gleaming, an untouchable fortress I only knew from newspaper headlines. What could she possibly have left me, the man who had long ago chosen the quiet life, a man she'd seemed to erase so completely? Through the window, Eleanor Henderson was still examining her waterlogged begonias, hands on her hips, poised for another confrontation. But her complaints now seemed to come from another world, distant and insignificant. "The chapel," I said slowly, the name a strange taste on my tongue. "Riverside Memorial on Grand Avenue. I'll be there." I sat there, staring at the phone, as if willing it to ring again, to deliver different news, a less final truth. The coffee stains on the floor had already begun to set, dark rings that would need scrubbing, but I couldn't move, couldn't quite process the simple, shattering fact. Brianna, vibrant, stubborn, impossible Brianna, was gone. The afternoon light slanted through the kitchen window, illuminating dust motes that danced like memories, those insistent, beautiful ghosts I had tried so hard to forget. The name, Brianna Elizabeth Flores, echoed in my mind, each syllable pulling me backward through time, through layers of regret and tenderness. I saw her again, standing in Murphy's Diner on a snowy February evening in 1987, a woman in a red wool coat, arguing with the manager about his hiring practices. Her voice, clear and uncompromising, sliced through the nearly empty restaurant, a beacon of defiance. I'd stopped mid-bite of my apple pie, fork suspended halfway to my mouth, mesmerized. Her profile, sharp cheekbones, determined jaw, dark hair catching the fluorescent light. She was magnificent in her anger, a force of nature. I found myself hoping the manager would argue more, just so I could listen to her dismantle his flimsy logic. "Ma'am, I didn't mean any offense," he stammered. "Of course, you didn't mean offense. You just meant to discriminate." She'd pulled a business card from her purse, sliding it across the counter with a quiet, devastating finality. When you change your mind about hiring based on qualifications rather than outdated assumptions, call me. The door chimes jingled as she left, and the diner felt smaller, somehow drained of electricity, of life. I watched her through the window, climbing into a blue Honda Civic, noting how she checked her mirrors twice before pulling into traffic. Careful, methodical, but unafraid to fight for what was right, for what she believed. "That one's trouble," the manager muttered, loud enough for the whole place to hear. I stood up, leaving a $5 bill next to my half-eaten pie. "No," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "That one's extraordinary." The business card lay abandoned on the counter. Brianna Chen, business consultant. I memorized the phone number before stepping out into the February wind, into a world that already felt different, charged with a new possibility. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to call. When I finally did, she answered on the second ring, brisk and confident. "Brianna Chen? This is Jerry Flores. We haven't met, but I saw you at Murphy's Diner on Friday night." A pause, then a smile in her voice, audible even through the phone line. "The man with the apple pie who defended my honor to the manager. You heard that? I was getting my gloves from the car. You left a good tip, too." "So, Jerry Flores, what can I do for you?" "Have dinner with me somewhere better than Murphy's?" Another pause, longer this time. "Are you asking me on a date, or do you need business consulting?" "Definitely a date. Though, if you have any advice about convincing beautiful women to have dinner with strangers, I could use the consultation." She laughed then, a real laugh, not the polite sound women sometimes made when men tried to be charming. "Saturday night, Romano's on 3rd Street, 7 o'clock. She wore the same red coat to dinner, but underneath a black dress that made my pulse race. A quiet elegance that was utterly Brianna. We talked for 3 hours about everything except business. Her childhood in California, my job at the power plant, our shared love of old movies and newer books. The world seemed to shrink to the edges of our table, intimate and perfect. When she laughed at my story about accidentally flooding my apartment while trying to fix a leaky faucet, I knew I was falling. Knew there was no turning back. 6 months later, I proposed in that same diner, sliding a ring across the same counter where she'd left her business card. "Marry me, Brianna Chen. Make me the luckiest man in Wyoming." She said yes before I'd finished asking, her eyes alight with a fierce joy that matched my own. Our wedding day blazed with September sunshine, the kind of perfect weather that makes promises feel absolutely possible, utterly real. Brianna wore her grandmother's dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and carried wildflowers we'd picked that morning. My hands shook as I slipped the ring onto her finger. "Forever," she whispered, and I believed her completely, without question. Dustin arrived 2 years later, a squalling, red-faced miracle who transformed our quiet house into something alive with purpose, with the chaotic joy of new life. I remember standing in the hospital room, watching Brianna cradle our son with the same fierce determination she brought to everything else, and thinking that this perfect moment, was all I'd ever need. But even then, holding that perfect baby, I noticed how Brianna's eyes occasionally drifted to the business magazine someone had left on the nightstand, a subtle shift in her gaze that hinted at other worlds, other ambitions. As Dustin grew from toddler to schoolboy, I began to notice things I'd missed in those first blissful, unburdened years. When he turned 7, Brianna bought him a computer. Not a toy, but a real machine, worth more than my monthly salary. A tool for a future I barely understood. He needs to understand technology, she explained, watching him navigate programs I'd never heard of. The future belongs to kids who think digitally. I'd suggested teaching him to fish instead. She'd laughed, but not kindly, a brittle sound that contained a hint of condescension. We'd moved by then to Hillcrest Avenue, a house with 3 bathrooms and a kitchen island bigger than our old apartment. Brianna's consulting firm had landed a contract with a mining consortium, and suddenly, we had money for things I'd never imagined needing, never desired. A housekeeper came twice a week. Our refrigerator dispensed ice through the door. Dustin's bedroom looked like a toy store, a consumerist dreamscape. "Isn't this wonderful?" Brianna asked one evening, gesturing at our new dining room with its crystal chandelier and a table that seated 12. "We can finally entertain properly." I missed our old kitchen table, scarred from years of Dustin's coloring projects and our late-night conversations. This new table reflected light like a mirror, showing every fingerprint, demanding coasters and placemats, an unspoken protocol of wealth. The entertaining started almost immediately. Business associates, potential clients, other successful couples whose conversations revolved around market share and investment strategies, a language I found increasingly foreign. I'd wear my best shirt and try to contribute, but discussions about hedge funds and corporate restructuring left me feeling like I was speaking a foreign language badly, awkwardly stumbling through unfamiliar territory. "Jerry works at the power plant," Brianna would explain when someone asked, and I heard something new in her voice. Not pride, but an apologetic edge, as if my job required an excuse, a footnote to her own soaring success. Dustin thrived in this new world, this ecosystem of ambition and capital. At 10, he could discuss computer programming with Brianna's tech-savvy clients, a precocious understanding of complex systems. At 12, he was critiquing the wine choices at restaurants I couldn't afford on my own, already cultivating a refined palate for the finer things. At 14, he rolled his eyes when I suggested family camping trips, preferring Brianna's business conferences in Denver and Salt Lake City, preferring the network to the wilderness. "Dad doesn't understand," became his favorite phrase, usually delivered with the exasperated sigh of someone far too sophisticated for mundane concerns, for the simple pleasures I still held dear. The first real fight came on Dustin's 15th birthday. Brianna had planned a party that looked more like a corporate networking event. Catered food, hired entertainment, a guest list full of business contacts and their children, carefully curated connections. I'd wanted something simpler. Maybe a barbecue in our backyard with his school friends, a genuine celebration of childhood. "This is embarrassing," I told her the night before, watching servers arrange elaborate flower arrangements. "He's 15, not 50. The sentiment felt like a scream against the suffocating opulence. "He's growing up in a different world than we did, Jerry." She adjusted a centerpiece with the same precision she brought to contract negotiations, her focus absolute. "These connections matter. These relationships will shape his future." "What about just being a kid?" I wanted to shout, but the words caught in my throat. She turned to face me fully, and for a moment, I saw something cold in her eyes, a sharp calculation where there used to be warmth. "Being just a kid is a luxury we can't afford to give him. The world is competitive. Either we prepare him to win, or we prepare him to lose." I thought about my own 15th birthday. Fishing with my father, a homemade cake, presents wrapped in newspaper comics. It had been perfect in its simplicity, perfect in its quiet joy. The party was a success by Brianna's standards. Dustin charmed the adults, networked with their children, received gifts that spoke of serious money. Laptop computers, designer clothes, a mountain bike worth more than some cars. But I caught him once, standing alone by the pool, looking lost among all the sophisticated celebration, a small, solitary figure swallowed by the spectacle. "You okay, buddy?" I asked, my voice soft. He straightened quickly, slipping back into the persona Brianna had helped him craft. Of course, why wouldn't I be? But for just a moment, I'd seen the confused little boy underneath all that premature sophistication, and it broke my heart. A silent, internal shattering. That party marked the beginning of the end, though I didn't recognize it then. What followed were 10 years of slow-motion disaster, like watching a landslide from the bottom of the mountain. Inevitable, destructive, and impossible to stop. Brianna's business consumed more of her time, more of her attention, more of her soul. Weekend family dinners became conference calls, the dinner table a battleground for corporate strategy. Vacation plans got canceled for client emergencies, the promise of escape replaced by the grind of relentless ambition. Dustin's school events competed with board meetings, and the meetings always won. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," she'd say when I complained about missing another of Dustin's baseball games. "This business supports our lifestyle. Someone has to make the hard choices." But I understood pressure, the kind that came from keeping a power grid running, from making sure thousands of people had electricity when they flipped their switches, a vital, tangible service. The difference was, my pressure served something larger than myself, a community, a public good. By the time Dustin graduated high school, he'd become a stranger to me, a carefully crafted product of his mother's world. Brianna had groomed him into her perfect protégé, sharp, ambitious, dismissive of anything that didn't advance his prospects. When I suggested he consider trade school along with college applications, he looked at me like I'd suggested he become a medieval serf, his gaze filled with a quiet contempt. "Dad, that's exactly the kind of thinking that's holding you back," he said, 17 years old and already talking like a business consultant. "You settled for mediocrity. I won't make that mistake." The words hit like physical blows, each one a fresh wound. Settled for mediocrity, as if 25 years of keeping the lights on for our community meant nothing. As if being a steady, present father was somehow shameful. College made everything worse, solidifying the chasm between us. Dustin chose business school, Brianna's alma mater, naturally, and came home for holidays full of theories about market dynamics and personal optimization. He looked at our house, our life, our values, with barely concealed contempt. "You could do more, Dad," he'd say, as if my contentment was a personal failing, a lack of drive. "Mom started with nothing and built an empire. You've had the same job for 20 years. "Some things matter more than money," I'd reply. But he'd already stopped listening, already dismissed my words as antiquated wisdom. The final explosion came during his senior year. Brianna had been working 100-hour weeks on some massive acquisition deal, consumed by the relentless pursuit of growth. I'd been handling everything at home: grocery shopping, laundry, the mundane, invisible tasks that kept life running, that made a home a home. When she missed Dustin's graduation because of a client crisis, a non-negotiable professional obligation, I finally said what had been building for years, a pressure cooker of unspoken truths finally bursting. "This is enough, Brianna. Family has to come first sometimes." She stood in our kitchen, that crystal and granite shrine to success, still wearing her business suit at midnight, checking emails on her phone, unreachable. "Don't you dare lecture me about priorities. Everything we have, everything Dustin's accomplished, exists because of my work." Her voice was cold, sharp, and utterly confident in its self-justification. "What about everything we've lost?" I asked, my own voice a quiet desperation. "Like what?" She finally looked up from her phone, genuinely puzzled, truly seeing me for the first time in months. Like us, like being a family instead of a corporation. She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw my answer in her eyes before she spoke. A chilling recognition. We weren't a family anymore. We were a business arrangement that had outlived its usefulness, a partnership dissolved by divergent values. Maybe it's time we stopped pretending this is working, she said quietly, her voice devoid of emotion. The divorce took 6 months. Brianna's lawyers were efficient, professional, devastating. I got the house on Maple Street, our old starter home that she'd kept as rental property, a small consolation prize. I received enough money to live modestly, to exist quietly. She got everything else, including Dustin's unquestioned loyalty, his absolute allegiance. You're holding him back, too, Dustin told me during one of our last conversations, before he moved to Denver to work for Brianna's company. All this guilt about family values and simple living. It's toxic, Dad. I can't be around that negativity anymore. I sat alone in my empty house afterward, surrounded by boxes of memories from a life that apparently meant nothing to the people I'd loved most, the people I'd given everything to. Now, 15 years later, the afternoon light was fading outside my apartment window. My coffee had grown cold, the ceramic shards still scattered on the floor, a mundane tableau of unaddressed small disasters. Somewhere across town, funeral preparations were underway for the woman who'd once promised me forever, and I had no idea why she'd remembered my name in her will. The thought was a strange, unsettling whisper in the quiet room. The 3 days between Janet Morrison's call and the funeral had passed in a strange, suspended state. I'd cleaned my apartment twice, a nervous energy propelling me through the tasks. I pressed my one good suit, rehearsed conversations that would never happen, prepared for a role I didn't understand. Each morning I'd considered not going, the urge to retreat overwhelming. But each evening found me still committed to paying my respects, whatever the cost, whatever the judgment. Friday morning arrived, gray and cold, typical May weather in Wyoming, reflecting the bleakness in my heart. I stood before my bathroom mirror, adjusting a tie I hadn't worn in 5 years, wondering what Brianna would think of the man I'd become. This quieter, older version of myself. The reflection showed someone older than I felt inside. Silver hair where brown used to be. My modest apartment complex gave way to middle-class subdivisions, then to the manicured lawns and stone facades where Brianna's circle lived. A world of privilege and ambition. The chapel sat on a hill overlooking the town, its Gothic architecture suggesting permanence and prosperity, an unyielding monument to success. Cars lined the circular drive, Mercedes sedans, BMW SUVs, a handful of Teslas that probably cost more than I'd made in my best year. I parked my 15-year-old Honda between a Lexus and a Cadillac, feeling like an intruder at someone else's celebration, an uninvited guest. The chapel's interior whispered money. Mahogany pews, stained glass windows, flowers arranged with artistic precision, every detail screaming of expensive taste. At least 200 people filled the space, their conversations creating a low hum of respectful mourning mixed with the unmistakable undertone of business networking. A constant, low-frequency hum of ambition. I recognized some faces from the business dinners Brianna had dragged me to during our married years. Ghosts from a former life. But most were strangers from the life she'd. The voice cut through the chapel's murmur like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. I looked up to see Dustin striding down the aisle. His face, "Maybe not," I replied, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. But I needed to be here. For what? To ease your conscience? I remained standing, holding his stare, unwavering. Around us, the chapel buzzed with anticipation, a collective holding. This is Jerry Flores, the man who spent 22 years holding back one of the most brilliant women this town has ever produced. While my mother was building an empire that employed hundreds of people, he was content to punch a time clock and complain about her ambitions. Dustin, that's enough. The words came out harder than I intended, a flash of indignation I couldn't suppress. Is it? Because I think these people deserve to understand why you're really here. He turned back to the crowd, his gaze sweeping across them like a judge preparing for a verdict. He took half her assets in the divorce, despite contributing nothing to her success. Then he spent 15 years acting like the victim while she built something magnificent. The crowd was fully engaged now, a few heads nodding in agreement, their faces reflecting a manufactured consensus. I saw faces I recognized, former neighbors, people I'd considered friends during the marriage, but none of them met my eyes, their gazes averted in discomfort or judgment. She supported him for years while he refused to grow, refused to take risks, refused to be the partner she deserved. And now that she's gone, he shows up expecting sympathy, expecting to be treated like he mattered in her life. Each word landed like a physical blow, not because they were entirely untrue, but because they reduced 22 years of marriage to a simple story of failure and blame, erasing all its nuances, all its quiet sacrifices. I thought about defending myself, explaining the complexity of what we'd shared, the love that had existed alongside the growing incompatibility, the slow, agonizing drift apart. But what was the point? These people had chosen their narrative long ago, cemented their convenient truth. My mother died building something that will outlast all of us, Dustin concluded, his voice rising with conviction, with an almost religious fervor. She deserved a husband who would have helped her reach those heights, not one who tried to drag her down to his level. The chapel fell silent, a heavy, suffocating quiet. I stood there, fully exposed, feeling the weight of 200 judgmental stares, a silent indictment. Part of me wanted to walk out, to spare myself the continued humiliation, to escape into the anonymity of the world outside. But another part, the part that had loved Brianna Chen more than anything else in the world, refused to be driven away from her final goodbye, refused to concede this last space. "Are you finished?" I asked quietly, my voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the silence. Dustin's eyes flashed with surprise. He'd expected me to crumble, to slink away in shame. When I remained standing, my quiet defiance unwavering, his confidence flickered for just a moment, a tiny crack in his self-assured facade. "I loved your mother for 40 years, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent chapel, resonating with an unexpected power. 22 of them as her husband, 18 more as someone who wished her well, despite everything that went wrong between us. I'm not here to make claims or demand recognition. I'm here because once upon a time, we made promises to each other that mattered, and I choose to honor that memory." I sat back down, folding my hands in my lap, the gesture a quiet declaration of finality. Around me, the silence stretched uncomfortably, a collective breath held. Dustin stood frozen in the aisle, apparently unprepared for resistance to his public trial, for a challenge to his carefully constructed narrative. "The service will begin in 5 minutes, someone announced from the front of the chapel. The funeral director probably, trying to restore order to his carefully orchestrated event, to regain control of the room. Dustin shot me one final look of contempt, a searing, bitter gaze, before striding toward the front pew, reserved for family, his rightful place. As conversations gradually resumed, I caught fragments of continued gossip. Nerve of some people. Poor Dustin having to deal with this. Should have stayed home. But I stayed. I stayed through the eulogy that painted Brianna as a visionary who'd overcome obstacles to achieve greatness, a testament to her unyielding ambition. I stayed through the readings from business associates who spoke of her leadership and innovation, through the musical selections that emphasized triumph over adversity. Each word, each note, a fresh twist of the knife, detailing a life I hadn't truly been a part of. When it ended, people filed past, offering condolences to Dustin while pointedly ignoring me. A silent, public excommunication. I waited until the chapel had mostly emptied before standing to leave, feeling the familiar weight of exhaustion settling over me like a heavy coat. The ordeal was nearly over. In a few minutes, I could slip out through the side door, drive home to my quiet apartment, and try to forget this entire humiliating experience. Around me, people were gathering their things, purses, programs, the subtle restlessness that signals a formal event's end. Dustin stood near the front, accepting condolences with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to being the center of attention, of controlling the narrative. A few people glanced my way, their curiosity tinged with judgment, but most had already dismissed me as irrelevant to the day's proceedings, a forgotten relic. I was reaching for my jacket when a voice stopped me. "Mr. Flores." Dan Morrison approached with measured steps, his expensive suit impeccable despite the long ceremony, a picture of quiet authority. Up close, he looked younger than I'd expected, maybe 50, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of confident bearing that came from years of handling wealthy clients' affairs, from navigating the complexities of their lives. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, extending his hand, his voice carrying a genuine note of sympathy. "Dan Morrison, Welsh Associates." We spoke briefly after the service. "Thank you," I said, shaking his hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze. "The service was very nice. Brianna would have appreciated it." "Indeed, she was quite specific about her final arrangements," he replied. He paused, glancing around the emptying chapel, a subtle assessment of the remaining audience. "I wonder if I might have a word with you and Dustin. There are some matters we need to discuss regarding Mrs. Flores' estate." Before I could respond, Dustin appeared at my shoulder, his expression shifting from practiced grief to alert interest, a predator sensing opportunity. "Dan, finally! I was wondering when we'd handle the business side of things." "Of course, Dustin. These matters require careful attention." Dan's voice carried the measured tone of someone accustomed to delivering important news, to holding power. "I'd like both of you to come to my office for the reading of your mother's will." "Both of us?" Dustin's eyebrows rose, a hint of disdain in his voice. "Is that necessary? I mean, he's not—" He gestured vaguely in my direction, dismissing me with a wave of his hand. "Your father is specifically named in the will, Dustin. His presence is required by law." I felt a flutter of surprise, a faint tremor in my chest. Named in the will. That seemed unlikely given everything that had passed between Brianna and me, the years of bitter silence. More likely some minor formality. Perhaps forgiving an old debt, or confirming that I had no claim to her estate. A final, definitive closure. "I don't think that's necessary," I said quietly, trying to deflect the obligation. "I'm sure it's just a formality. You don't need me there." Dan's eyes met mine directly, unwavering. I'm afraid I do, Mr. Flores. Mrs. Flores was very specific about who should be present for the reading. Both you and Dustin must be there. Something in his tone suggested this wasn't negotiable, that there was a weight to this request, an unspoken command. Dustin looked annoyed, but shrugged with the casual confidence of someone who knew he had nothing to worry about. Someone who felt an inherent right to whatever was coming. Fine, let's get this over with. He turned to me with barely concealed impatience. Try not to make this more difficult than it needs to be. His words were a warning, a veiled threat of escalation if I dared to disrupt his narrative. The walk to Dan's office took us 3 blocks through downtown Rock Springs, past buildings that had watched the town's fortunes rise and fall with the energy industry, monuments to transient wealth. Dan maintained professional small talk, comments about the weather, the turnout at the service, carefully neutral observations that revealed nothing about what awaited us, maintaining the professional facade. His office occupied the top floor of a restored Victorian house, all dark wood and leather-bound books that spoke of established success, of old money and quiet power. Certificates and diplomas lined the walls, interrupted by photographs of Dan with various local dignitaries and business leaders, a curated display of influence. It was exactly the kind of place Brianna would have chosen. Prestigious, but not ostentatious. Successful, but respectful of tradition. An embodiment of her own carefully cultivated image. Please have a seat. Dan gestured toward 2 leather chairs positioned in front of his mahogany desk, a stage set for revelation. Dustin claimed the chair closest to Dan, leaving me the one slightly to the side, which felt appropriate given my peripheral status in these proceedings, an outsider looking in. Dan settled behind his desk and opened a thick file folder, extracting several legal documents with the careful precision of someone who'd performed this ritual countless times, a practiced choreography of power. The afternoon light slanted through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the suddenly quiet room, witnesses to the unfolding drama. Before we begin, Dan said, adjusting his glasses, his voice solemn, I want to express my condolences again. Brianna was not only a valued client, but someone I considered a friend. Her loss is deeply felt by everyone who knew her. Dustin nodded solemnly, a performance of grief. I remained silent, unsure what response was expected from someone whose relationship with the deceased was so complicated, so fraught with unspoken history. Dan lifted the top document, several pages bound with a blue backing, and cleared his throat. This is the last will and testament of Brianna Elizabeth Flores, executed on March 15, 2024, and properly witnessed according to Wyoming state law. The will supersedes all previous wills and codicils. Only 14 months ago, I thought, a surprising detail. I wondered what had prompted Brianna to update her will so recently. Had she been sick? Had something happened that made her contemplate mortality, forcing a reckoning with her legacy? The will confirms that Mrs. Flores was of sound mind and disposing memory when these documents were prepared, and that she was under no undue influence or coercion. Dan's voice carried the formal cadence of legal proceedings, each word carefully enunciated, each phrase a shield against challenge. Dustin leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together, his body language radiating anticipation. A man preparing to claim his inheritance, to finally step fully into the empire his mother had built, to inherit the mantle of power. Dan turned to the second page of the will, his reading glasses catching the afternoon light as he continued in his measured, professional tone. I hereby make the following specific bequests and devises, he read, his voice steady and clear, cutting through the heavy silence. To my beloved son, Dustin Michael Flores, I leave the family home at 847 Hillcrest Avenue, along with all furnishings, artwork, and personal property contained therein. Dustin smiled, a satisfied expression spreading across his face, a silent victory. The Hillcrest house was worth at least $800,000, a substantial property with mountain views and enough space to entertain business associates properly, a fitting symbol of his inherited status. Additionally, Dan continued, his voice unwavering, I bequeath to Dustin the sum of $500,000 to be transferred from my primary investment account within 60 days of probate. $500,000 plus the house. I watched Dustin's reaction carefully, noting how his smile flickered slightly around the edges, a shadow of calculation. He was pleased, certainly, but I could see him calculating in his head. $500,000 was significant money, yes, but Brianna's business empire was worth far more than that. Vastly more. Where was the rest? Where was the company, the crown jewel? That's wonderful, of course, Dustin said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty he was trying to mask, a subtle tremor of dissatisfaction. But what about Mom's business interests? The company? Dan set down the first page and lifted the second, his expression remaining professionally neutral, unreadable. I'm continuing with the specific bequests, Dustin. Please allow me to finish reading the relevant sections. I shifted in my chair, feeling increasingly like an intruder witnessing a private family moment, an uncomfortable voyeur. $500,000 was more money than I'd seen in several lifetimes, an unimaginable sum. Combined with the house, Dustin was receiving an inheritance that would set him up comfortably for years, a life of ease and security. It seemed appropriate, natural even. He was Brianna's son, her chosen successor in life, the person she'd groomed to understand her world, to carry on her legacy. The bequest to Dustin, Dan continued, his words slow and deliberate, includes the following conditions. The inheritance is contingent upon his continued employment with Flores Consulting Solutions for a minimum of 2 years following the date of this will's execution, or until such time as the company is sold or dissolved. Now Dustin looked genuinely confused, his smooth facade cracking. Conditions? What kind of conditions? And what do you mean, until the company is sold? Who would sell it? I'm reading the will as written, Dustin. These are your mother's words, not mine. A tension I hadn't noticed before began to creep into the room, a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Dustin's confident posture shifted slightly, his hands unclenching and reclenching in his lap, a nervous tick. I found myself leaning forward, despite my intention to remain detached from these proceedings, drawn into the unfolding mystery. Let me understand this clearly, Dustin said, his voice taking on an edge I recognized from our confrontation at the chapel, a dangerous, brittle tone. I get the house and $500,000, but there are strings attached? And you're talking about the company being sold? That doesn't make sense. Mom would never sell the company. It was her life's work. He was speaking to a fundamental truth of Brianna, a core tenet of her being. Dan removed his glasses and cleaned them carefully. A deliberate, almost theatrical gesture that seemed designed to give everyone a moment to process what they'd heard, to let the implications sink in. When he replaced them, his gaze moved between Dustin and me with an expression I couldn't quite read, a mixture of sympathy and professional distance. Your mother's will contains additional provisions that address the disposition of her remaining assets, he said quietly, his voice now imbued with a new, unsettling weight. The company, her investment portfolio, and several other significant holdings. Well, then let's hear them, Dustin demanded, his patience clearly wearing thin, his control beginning to fray. What are these other provisions? I watched this exchange with growing unease. Something about Dan's manner suggested that we were approaching territory none of us were prepared for. A precipice of unexpected truth. The careful way he was parsing his words, the slightly apologetic tone creeping into his voice. It reminded me of the way doctors spoke when they had difficult news to deliver. A solemn, premonitory cadence. "Before I continue," Dan said, settling back in his chair, his gaze firm, "I want to emphasize that these documents represent Mrs. Flores's final, considered wishes. They were prepared after extensive discussion and consultation, and she was adamant about their contents." The room fell silent, except for the tick of an antique clock on Dan's bookshelf. Each second a slow, deliberate drumbeat, building tension. Dustin stared at the lawyer with growing alarm, while I found myself wondering why Brianna had insisted I be present for what seemed like a straightforward family matter. What intricate game was being played? Dan lifted the third page of the will, his eyes scanning the text briefly before looking up at both of us, his expression now uncharacteristically somber. "However," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made my stomach tighten, an impending sense of doom, "there are additional provisions that fundamentally alter the distribution of Mrs. Flores's estate." He lifted his reading glasses and looked directly at me for the first time since we'd entered his office. Something in his expression made my stomach tighten, a mixture of sympathy and professional obligation that suggested I was about to hear something I wasn't prepared for. A truth that would shake the foundations of my quiet existence. "However," he continued, his voice taking on additional weight, "the will contains provisions for the disposition of Mrs. Flores's remaining assets, which constitute the majority of her estate." Dustin leaned forward even further, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair, his body rigid with anticipation, sensing a shift, a new direction. "Finally, let's hear about the company and the rest of her investments." Dan returned his attention to the document, clearing his throat with the deliberate pause of someone about to deliver life-changing news, to detonate a silent bomb. "To my former husband, Jerry Michael Flores," he read, his words falling into the quiet office like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread far and wide. "I bequeath the sum of $33.5 million to be transferred from my primary investment accounts and securities portfolio." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, an invisible shockwave. I felt my mouth fall open, a physical reaction I couldn't control, a visceral shock. $33.5 million. The number was so large it didn't seem real. Didn't seem to apply to someone like me sitting in a lawyer's office in Rock Springs, Wyoming, a man whose biggest financial concern was a leaky sprinkler. "There must be some mistake," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and distant, a whisper from another world. "Did you say 33 million? 33? 5 million? "Yes." Dan's tone remained professionally neutral, but I caught something in his eyes. Not surprise, but the careful observation of someone watching expected chaos unfold. Someone who had seen this scenario before. Dustin's face had gone completely white, then flushed red, as if his blood couldn't decide which direction to flow. A physical manifestation of disbelief and rage. "What did you just say?" His voice was barely a choked gasp. "Additionally," Dan continued reading, apparently determined to deliver the complete bombshell, to leave no doubt, "I transferred to Jerry Flores controlling interest in Flores Consulting Solutions, including all subsidiary companies, real estate holdings, and business assets. This transfer includes 65% ownership of all corporate entities and an appointment as chairman of the board of directors." I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt sideways, as if the laws of physics had suddenly changed their minds about how the world should work. controlling interest in Brianna's company, the empire I'd watched her build from nothing, the business that had eventually consumed our marriage, the source of wealth that had made me feel so inadequate, so small. She was giving it all to me. This can't be right. My voice came out as barely a whisper, a thread of disbelief. There has to be some error in the documentation. I assure you, Mr. Flores, there is no error. Dan removed his glasses again, cleaning them with methodical precision, his hands steady, controlled. These documents were prepared under Mrs. Flores's direct supervision. She reviewed every word multiple times and confirmed these were her exact wishes. Dustin shot to his feet so abruptly his chair rolled backward and struck the wall, the sound a sharp crack in the stunned silence. "This is impossible! She wouldn't! She couldn't!" He turned to stare at me with an expression of pure disbelief mixed with something darker, something venomous. "What did you do? How did you manipulate her?" "I didn't do anything," I said weakly, still trying to process the impossibility of what I just heard, the sheer magnitude of the truth. "I haven't spoken to your mother in 15 years. "Liar!" The word exploded from Dustin like a gunshot, echoing off the office walls. He slammed his palm against Dan's desk, sending papers scattering, a violent display of raw fury. "People don't just give away $33 million to their ex-husbands for no reason. You must have gotten to her somehow. Convinced her when she was sick, when she wasn't thinking clearly." Dan's voice cut through Dustin's rising hysteria with professional authority, firm and unyielding. "I can assure you that Mrs. Flores was of completely sound mind when she executed these documents. She underwent a thorough mental competency evaluation, specifically to prevent any future challenges to the will's validity." I sat frozen in my chair, watching this scene unfold as if it were happening to someone else, a surreal play. The numbers Dan had read, $33.5 million, controlling interest in a multi-million-dollar company, belonged in a different universe than the one where I worried about grocery bills and car repairs, a world I knew nothing about. "But why?" I asked, the question emerging from some deep place of confusion and disbelief, a desperate plea for understanding. "Why would she do this?" Dan gathered the will documents into a neat stack, his movements careful and deliberate, bringing order to the chaos. "Mrs. Flores left specific instructions regarding that question, Mr. Flores. She asked me to share a personal message with you after reading these provisions." Dustin's face contorted with rage and betrayal, a primal scream barely suppressed. "A personal message? She left him a personal message, but cut me out of everything that mattered?" "You received a substantial inheritance, Dustin," Dan replied calmly, his voice a steady anchor. $500,000 and a valuable property represent more wealth than most people see in their lifetimes. Compared to what he's getting, Dustin pointed at me with a shaking finger, his voice trembling with fury. "You're talking about hundreds of millions in total assets. The company alone is worth more than everything else combined." The room pulsed with tension so thick I could taste it, a metallic tang of rage and disbelief. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I realized that my entire life had just changed in ways I couldn't begin to comprehend, fundamentally altered. But all I could focus on was the impossible fact that Brianna, stubborn, ambitious Brianna, who had grown to resent everything I represented, had somehow decided to give me everything she'd built. That's when Dustin completely lost control, his carefully constructed persona shattering. "This is fraud!" he screamed, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated rage. "Criminal fraud! She was manipulated, coerced, mentally compromised." He whirled toward me, his face twisted with fury and disbelief, a grotesque mask. "You did something to her. There's no other explanation." I shrank back in my chair, overwhelmed by the violence of his reaction, the sheer force of his accusation. "Dustin, I swear to you, I had no contact with your mother. I didn't even know she was sick." "Liar!" He slammed his palm against Dan's desk again, a desperate, childish act of defiance, scattering papers once more. "Nobody gives away everything they've built to someone who abandoned their family, someone who couldn't even be bothered to call when she was dying." "She didn't abandon anyone," I said quietly, finding some small reserve of strength, a stubborn core of self-respect. "Our marriage ended, but that doesn't mean—" "It means exactly that." Dustin's voice rose to a near shriek, full of bitter resentment. "You walked away from us. You took your pathetic settlement and disappeared into your pathetic little life while she built an empire. And now you want me to believe she just decided to hand it all over to you?" Dan's voice cut through the chaos with professional authority, a sharp, decisive blade. "Mr. Flores, Dustin, I understand this is difficult news, but I must insist you control yourself. These are your mother's clearly stated wishes, executed with full legal authority." Dustin spun toward the lawyer, his eyes blazing, unhinged. "I want every document examined. I want psychiatric evaluations. I want to know every single contact this man had with my mother in the past 5 years." "There were no contacts," Dan replied calmly, unflustered. "Mrs. Flores made that very clear when she explained her decision." "Explained her decision?" Dustin's laugh was bitter and sharp, laced with scorn. "So she did explain why she decided to betray her only son and give everything to the man who ruined her first marriage. She left a personal message for your father, yes?" The word father seemed to hit Dustin like a physical blow, stripping him bare. For just a moment his rage flickered, and something else showed through. A pain so deep it made my chest ache, a raw wound of filial devotion. Then the fury returned, doubled in intensity, a desperate shield. "He's not my father," Dustin snarled, his voice a guttural growl. "My father would have been there when she needed him. My father would have supported her dreams instead of trying to drag her down." He turned back to me, his face contorted with years of accumulated resentment, a lifetime of unspoken grievances. "You're nothing but a failed man who couldn't handle being married to someone better than you." Each word landed like a knife thrust, not because they were entirely false, but because they contained enough truth to draw blood, to pierce the quiet dignity I had built. I had felt inadequate during those final years. I had struggled with Brianna's success. I had been the one who couldn't adapt to the world she was creating, the one left behind. "Maybe you're right," I said quietly, acknowledging a sliver of his pain. "Maybe I wasn't the husband she deserved. But I never asked for this. I never expected this." "Expected?" Dustin's voice climbed another octave, shrill and accusatory. "You orchestrated this. Somehow, some way, you got to her when she was vulnerable, when she was sick or scared or—" "That's enough," Dan interrupted, his professional patience finally showing strain, his voice like cracking ice. "Mrs. Flores was neither sick nor vulnerable when she made these decisions. She was, in fact, more determined and clear-minded than I'd ever seen her." "Then why?" Dustin demanded, his voice breaking slightly, a sudden vulnerability in his roar. "Why would she do this to me? I was everything she wanted me to be. I worked for her company. I lived the life she planned for me. I became the son she could be proud of." The pain in his voice cut through my own shock, my own numb disbelief. Despite everything, the years of hostility, the public humiliation, the bitter accusations, I saw him clearly for a moment. A man who had spent his entire adult life trying to earn his mother's approval, only to discover she'd given her ultimate validation to someone else, to the man he despised. She left a message explaining her reasoning, Dan said gently, his voice softening, offering a balm to the raw wounds. Would you like me to read it? Dustin's hands were shaking now, his whole body vibrating with suppressed rage and grief, a contained explosion. A message? She couldn't explain it to my face, but she left a message for him? The message addresses both of you, actually. It was meant to be shared after the will reading. I found my voice, though it came out hoarse and uncertain, a whisper of hope. Maybe we should hear what she had to say. Dustin's eyes locked on mine with pure hatred, a furious, burning gaze. You have no right to make decisions here. You have no right to any of this. But even as he spoke, I could see the desperate need in his expression, the urgent, pleading need to understand why his mother had chosen to shatter everything he'd believed about his place in her world, about his own identity. Dan was already reaching for another envelope, one with personal message written across it in Brianna's familiar, confident handwriting. Dan raised his hand, commanding silence with the authority of someone accustomed to controlling emotional courtrooms, to bringing order to chaos. Enough, both of you. His voice cut through the tension like a blade, sharp and decisive. Before this goes any further, I have something that will explain everything. He opened the manila envelope with Brianna's distinctive handwriting across the front, extracting several pages of cream-colored stationery. Brianna knew this moment would be difficult. She asked me to read this personal message after the will was announced. Dustin slumped back into his chair, his rage momentarily displaced by desperate curiosity, his fury yielding to an urgent need for answers. I remained frozen, afraid to hope for understanding, but desperate for any explanation that might make sense of this impossible situation, this unbelievable truth. Dan cleared his throat and began reading in Brianna's own words. My dearest Jerry, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone, and you're probably sitting in Dan's office wondering if the entire world has lost its mind. I can picture your face, that expression you used to get when I'd rearranged the living room furniture without warning, confused but trying to be polite about it. Despite everything, I felt my lips curve into the ghost of a smile. She'd captured that expression perfectly, and somehow hearing her voice through Dan's reading made her feel present in the room, a tangible, living presence. I know this inheritance comes as a shock. I know you're probably thinking there's been some terrible mistake, that you don't deserve this money or this responsibility. But Jerry, you're wrong. You deserve every penny, and I'm going to tell you why. Dan paused, glancing up at both of us before continuing, letting the words hang in the air, allowing them to settle. I never stopped loving you. Not during our worst fights. Not during the divorce proceedings. Not during these 15 years of stubborn silence. I was angry with you for not understanding my ambitions, but I was angrier with myself for choosing those ambitions over our marriage. You tried to save us, Jerry. You begged me to find balance, to remember what mattered. I was too proud and too afraid to listen. The words hit me like physical blows, each one a fresh wave of absolution. I felt tears starting, hot and unexpected, as decades of guilt and regret crystallized into this moment of impossible, unearned grace. Dustin, the message continued, and I saw my son's head snap up at hearing his name, a sudden jolt. My beautiful, brilliant boy. I know you're furious right now. Probably convinced your father somehow manipulated me. But sweetheart, you're not ready for this inheritance. Not yet. Dustin's face went white, then red, cycling through emotions too quickly to track, a kaleidoscope of shattered expectations. You've lived your entire adult life in the shadow of my success, accepting the benefits without understanding the responsibility. You've never had to build something from nothing. Never had to make the hard choices that wealth requires. More importantly, you've spent 15 years hating a good man for crimes he never committed. That's not true, Dustin whispered, but his voice lacked conviction, a hollow protest. Dan continued reading, his voice unwavering. Jerry taught me about character, about integrity, about the kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself through cruelty or judgment. I forgot those lessons when I chose money over marriage, business over love. But I never forgot the man who taught them to me. I was crying openly now, not caring how it looked, not caring about the public spectacle. Brianna's words were rebuilding something inside me that I thought was permanently broken. The sense that I had value, that my quiet life of dignity and service meant something, meant everything. Dustin, you have received enough to live comfortably and explore who you might become without the weight of unlimited wealth. Learn to build something yourself. Learn to value people over profit. Learn to forgive your father for the crime of being human and imperfect. Dustin made a sound like a wounded animal, a choked, guttural cry, but whether from rage or pain, I couldn't tell. Jerry, you're inheriting more than money. You're inheriting the chance to do what I should have done, to use wealth as a tool for good rather than a weapon for proving superiority. I trust you because you never wanted this, because you'll never use it to hurt people the way I sometimes did. The message continued for several more paragraphs, outlining practical arrangements and expressing hopes for both our futures, a final testament to her enduring love and wisdom. But the core message was clear. Brianna had chosen love over entitlement, character over expectation, wisdom over wealth. When Dan finished reading, the office fell into profound silence, thick and heavy. I sat with tears on my cheeks, overwhelmed by the gift of knowing that Brianna had loved me until the end, that her sharp mind had finally returned to the simple, profound truth. Dustin stared at the floor, his entire worldview crumbling around him, the foundations of his existence shattered. Finally, Dan folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope. She asked me to give this to you, Jerry. The original is yours to keep. I reached for the letter with trembling hands, holding the last conversation I would ever have with the woman who had shaped my life in ways both beautiful and painful. The weight of Brianna's words settled over the office like dust after an explosion, a quiet, pervasive presence. For several minutes, none of us spoke. I held her letter against my chest, feeling the physical reality of her final gift. Not just the money, but the restoration of my worth in her eyes, and more importantly, in my own. Dustin was the first to break the silence, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "This isn't over," he said quietly. But the fire had gone out of his voice, replaced by a cold, calculating edge. "I can contest this. Mental incapacity, undue influence, fraud. There are ways to challenge a will." I looked at him, really looked at him, For the first time since we'd entered Dan's office, seeing past the rage to the fragile, entitled core. I saw a man who had spent his entire life expecting the world to bend to his wishes, who had never learned that love couldn't be inherited or demanded, only earned, painstakingly built. "You could try," I said gently, my voice calm, steady. "But your mother was right, Dustin. You're not ready for this responsibility." "And you are?" His laugh was bitter, hollow, full of contempt. "You're a nobody, Dad."
A retired power plant worker with no business experience, no connections, no understanding of what it takes to run a company worth hundreds of millions. For a moment, the old Jerry, the one who had felt inadequate for 22 years, wanted to agree with him, to shrink back into the familiar shadow of self-doubt. But Brianna's words echoed in my mind, a quiet strength. "You deserve every penny." "Maybe you're right," I said, standing up slowly, feeling a new kind of resolve settle in my bones. "Maybe I don't know anything about running a business empire, but I know something your mother valued more than business expertise." "What's that?" His voice was sharp, impatient. "I know the difference between serving others and serving myself." Dustin's face twisted with a final flash of rage, a desperate, final attempt to regain control. "This is insane. She was sick. She was old. She wasn't thinking clearly." Dan's voice cut through the outburst with professional finality, a crisp, unwavering pronouncement. "Your mother was 62 years old and in perfect mental health when she executed these documents. She underwent extensive psychological evaluation specifically to prevent the kind of challenges you're threatening." "Then why?" Dustin's voice cracked like a teenager's, a raw, exposed wound. "Why would she do this to me?" I felt a surge of unexpected compassion for this angry man who was, despite everything, still my son, still a part of me. "She didn't do it to you, Dustin. She did it for you. She gave you a chance to discover who you are when you're not living in the shadow of unlimited wealth, to find your own path, your own worth." "I don't want that chance." The words exploded from him with the force of 15 years of entitlement and expectation, a lifetime of believing he was owed everything. "I want what's rightfully mine." "What's rightfully yours," I said quietly, firmly, "is $500,000 and a house worth nearly $1 million. That's more than most people see in a lifetime. What you think you deserved was never really yours to begin with." Dustin stared at me for a long moment, and I saw him realize that something fundamental had changed, a tectonic shift in our relationship. The man he'd publicly humiliated that morning, the father he'd dismissed as a failure, was no longer asking for his approval or understanding. "You think you've won," he said, gathering his coat with shaking hands, his voice thin, defeated. "You think this makes you some kind of hero?" "No," I replied, and I felt the truth of it in my bones, a quiet, deep certainty. "I think it makes me responsible." He stood at the office door for a moment, seeming smaller than when he'd entered, his shoulders slumped. "This isn't finished." "Yes, it is," I said gently, my voice carrying the weight of finality. "This finished the moment your mother made her choice. The only question now is what you do with the life she's given you." He left without another word, the door closing behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. A closing chapter. Dan began organizing papers on his desk, the rustle of documents returning us to practical reality, to the immediate, tangible demands of the present. "There will be paperwork to complete, accounts to transfer, board meetings to schedule.
The company's current management team is excellent. They can help you transition into your new role. I nodded, still processing the magnitude of what had happened, the unexpected burden and gift. Dan, can I ask you something? Of course. Did she really love me, even after everything that went wrong between us? He smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him all day, a rare glimpse of warmth. Jerry, she talked about you every time we met.
Not about the divorce, not about the problems, but about the man who taught her that success without character is just expensive failure. His words were a final, unexpected blessing, a confirmation of a truth I had almost forgotten. I walked out of that office a different man than the one who had entered. The afternoon sun felt warmer, the air cleaner, carrying a fresh scent of possibility. I had work to do, responsibilities to embrace, a company to learn about and improve, a legacy to transform. But for the first time in 15 years, I felt worthy of the challenge. Not because of the money, but because of the recognition, the quiet vindication. Justice, I realized, wasn't about revenge or vindication in the petty sense, or the triumph of one over another. It was about recognition. The recognition that character matters more than credentials, that patience outlasts entitlement, and that love, real love, the kind that survives time and anger and distance, never truly dies. Quiana had seen all of that, in the quiet wisdom she finally chose. And in her final act, she had given me the chance to prove her right, to finally live out the truth we had once built together.